Since December 5th, 1943, the rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Thick jungle mud swallowed boots, and the air was heavy with rot and gunpowder. Somewhere in the chaos of the Pacific Theater, on a nameless stretch of island clawed over by both American and Japanese forces, the men of Charlie Company sat waiting in silence. Their trench was shallow and hastily dug, barely enough to keep them hidden. But it was all they had. Private Ray Dobbs gripped the smooth, oil-slicked body of his Winchester Model 1912 like a lifeline. His knuckles were white around the fore-end, his finger resting just off the trigger. Beside him, Sergeant McCready gave a low grunt, chewing a piece of soaked tobacco, eyes fixed forward through the rain-smeared slit of the trench. Dobbs had been in-country only 3 months, but McCready, Mac, had seen it all. Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and now this miserable pit of hell. "Keep your head down, kid," Mac muttered, spitting. "They're close." He didn't need to say it. The jungle didn't lie. The birds had stopped chirping half an hour ago. That eerie silence always came before something bad, something violent. Somewhere out there, beyond the hanging vines and soaked palm trees, the Japanese soldiers were moving, silent as ghosts. Their bayonets gleamed in the mist like silver fangs. Dobbs's heart pounded. He had never seen a man die up close before. He'd heard screams from the foxholes, seen the stretchers, seen the faces turn to blood and mud. But he hadn't pulled the trigger in real combat. Not yet. The Winchester in his hands felt heavier than ever. McCready reached over and tapped Dobbs's helmet twice. "Listen, don't fire like you're scared. Slam it. Keep slamming it. That's what the M12 does. That's what it's made for." Dobbs nodded, uncertain. Then it happened. A sudden shrill cry cut through the jungle. An officer's command in Japanese. Leaves exploded. A wall of green burst open as a wave of Japanese infantry charged forward, bayonets gleaming, eyes wide with the hunger of death. The ground shook with their footfalls, their cries mixing with the pounding rain. Dobbs froze. For a second, he couldn't breathe. McCready stood up. "Now!" The trench erupted. McCready racked his M12 so fast it sounded like thunder. The first shell spat fire and steel into the face of the closest Japanese soldier, blowing him backwards into the mud like a puppet with its strings cut. Before Dobbs could process it, Mac was already slam-firing, hand-pumping the shotgun like a machine, each blast roaring over the trench wall like a cannon. Dobbs rose. He pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder like a punch from God, but he didn't stop. He pumped the fore-end and fired again, and again, and again. The slam-fire mechanism of the Winchester M12 didn't wait. As long as he held the trigger and racked the action, it kept thundering. It was like holding a dragon by the throat. The front row of Japanese infantry were torn apart. Flesh ripped. Helmets flew. Screams erupted in every direction. Dobbs didn't aim anymore. He just kept firing, the spray of buckshot eating through the jungle mist. Bodies hit the mud. Bayonets dropped. And still, the Americans fired. Behind Dobbs, another M12 blasted through the roar. Private Jenkins, face twisted into rage and fear, screamed as he poured fire from the shotgun, his barrel glowing red with heat. The Japanese had expected a standard firefight, maybe even a break in American morale. What they got was a slam-fire storm of .00 buckshot, rage, and survival instinct from men who had been living on the edge of sanity. They didn't stand a chance. As the last shells in his tube magazine spat out into the slaughter, Dobbs fell back into the trench, gasping, hands shaking. Smoke rose around him. The rain had turned pink where it hit the edges of the trench wall. His ears rang, but all he could hear was McCready laughing. "See, kid?" Mac said, slamming in new shells without even looking. They didn't expect that. Dobbs looked up. The jungle ahead was still again, silent. But this time, it was the silence of death. The silence didn't last long. Somewhere beyond the corpses and shredded jungle brush, A Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun opened up with a furious chatter, its bullets tearing through palm trees and peppering the trench line with dirt and splinters. Dobbs dropped down, heart pounding again, as a tree nearby split in half and crashed down with a roar. The ground shuddered. "Down!" McCready shouted, pulling Jenkins by the collar just before a burst of rounds stitched the air above them. Dobbs couldn't think. He could barely breathe. The ringing in his ears now blended with the high-pitched drone of panic. He felt something wet on his cheek. Blood. He didn't know whose. "Jesus Christ, they're setting up for a second wave!" Someone shouted from down the trench. A lieutenant, maybe. Or just another scared soul. McCready reached over and grabbed Dobbs by the front of his jacket, pulling him close. "You see that?" he said, pointing just over the edge of the trench. "That gun nest, tucked behind that rotted log near the ridge?" Dobbs peeked, and sure enough, the muzzle flashes lit up the fog like a strobe light. "I need you to get close enough to burn it down," Mac said. "Take your M12, go low. Use the side brush." Dobbs blinked, stunned. "You want me to what?" "I said move." "That shotgun's not made for sittin' pretty, Private. It's made for hell." There was no time to argue. Another burst from the Type 92 cut down the man next to them. Sergeant Luis, a father of 3. His helmet flew off like a coin, his body twitching before slumping into the mud. Dobbs swallowed his fear and scrambled out of the trench, every nerve screaming. He crouched low, his body hunched, heart slamming against his ribs harder than the M12's recoil. The rain was heavier now, like the sky itself was trying to drown the war. He moved through the brush, ignoring the leeches, the fire ants, the smell of rot. The jungle closed around him, but he kept moving, circling wide toward the gun nest. Every footstep felt like thunder in his ears. Every breath felt stolen. As he neared the ridge, he could see them. 3 Japanese soldiers manning the heavy gun, their faces calm, mechanical. They didn't know he was there. He slid into position behind a thick banyan root, his hands trembling as he racked another shell into the chamber. "Do it," he whispered to himself. "Just slam and don't stop." He stepped out from the foliage and fired. The first blast caught the gunner square in the ribs, lifting him off the ground like a broken doll. The other 2 turned, startled, but Dobbs didn't give them time to react. He kept the trigger down and pumped, slam-firing 2 more rounds in under 2 seconds. One shell caught the assistant gunner in the neck, the other hit the last man in the side of the head. They went down, screaming. The machine gun went silent. Dobbs stood there, chest heaving, smoke curling from the muzzle of his M12. His ears were ringing again, but this time with a strange kind of quiet pride. Back at the trench, the men had seen the gun go quiet. A cheer went up. It was ragged, full of blood and rage, but it was real. Dobbs turned to return, but before he could take a step, he heard a whisper of movement behind him. He spun. Too late. A Japanese soldier, young, face smeared with blood and mud, lunged from the foliage with a bayonet, eyes wide with fanatic fury. Dobbs raised the shotgun, but the blade was already coming down. And then, boom! The enemy's chest exploded in a cloud of blood and bone as McCready stepped through the fog. "Smoking shotgun in hand? You really thought I'd let you go alone?" he said with a half-smile. "Not a damn chance." Dobbs collapsed, breathing hard, laughing even though his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He looked at the mangled gun nest behind him and the lifeless bodies scattered around it. "Was that good enough for hell?" he asked. McCready gave him a nod. "Kid, you brought the whole damn storm." The sun never rose in that jungle. Not really. Even when the sky lightened, the thick canopy choked out most of the light, and what did trickle through only made the bloodstains shine redder. By the time Dobbs and McCready made it back to the trench, Charlie Company had already suffered another loss. 2 more men gone in a desperate attempt to secure the left flank. One had stepped on a mine. The other had bled out holding a letter from home, but morale had shifted. Word spread fast. Dobbs had taken out the machine gun nest by himself. Some called him crazy. Some called him brave. All of them looked at him differently now. He didn't feel different, though. He sat against the trench wall, shotgun across his lap, hands still twitching from adrenaline and fear. His uniform was soaked through with water and blood. Some of it his, most of it not. Jenkins crouched beside him, reloading his own M12 with shaky fingers. "You looked like a damn ghost when you came back," Jenkins said, trying to grin. "Like you'd just stared the devil in the eye." Dobbs didn't answer. He was staring into the jungle again, waiting for the next wave, because he knew it wasn't over. Not even close. McCready moved down the line, checking weapons, patching wounded, barking orders like the devil's own drill sergeant. But even his voice had a crack in it now. They were holding the line by inches, and every inch was soaked in American blood. Then the whistle blew. Not theirs. The sound shrieked from the trees, a high-pitched command, followed by the pounding of boots. It wasn't a wave this time. It was a flood. Dozens, maybe 100. Japanese soldiers poured from the tree line screaming, bayonets raised high. They moved like shadows through the smoke and rain, their eyes burning with something unholy. Behind them came grenades, small black pineapples of death, rolling into the trench with deadly clinks. "Grenade!" someone shouted. Dobbs grabbed Jenkins and threw him backward, just as one of the grenades detonated. Dirt and blood exploded around them. McCready was already standing, firing. His M12 belched flame as he slam-fired like a demon unleashed. The force of the blasts threw charging soldiers back like rag dolls. Dobbs stood, aimed, and started firing again. His ears rang, his shoulder burned, but he didn't stop. Pump. Fire. Pump. Fire. Each shell tore through the enemy like a steel storm. Bodies fell into the trench. Dobbs kicked one off his boot, blood smearing his leg. The trench was no longer just a place to hide. It had become a slaughter pit. And still they came. One soldier leapt into the trench with a katana, slicing wildly. He nearly took Jenkins's arm off before McCready shot him point-blank in the face. Another tried to strangle Dobbs, and Dobbs had to beat him down with the wooden stock of his shotgun until the man stopped moving. Then came the worst sound yet. A deep rumble. Not from the trees, but from the ground. "They've got a damn tunnel!" Someone screamed, and then it exploded. The ground beneath the left flank blew upward in a burst of smoke and flame. Japanese soldiers rose from a hidden tunnel, crawling out like ants, stabbing, slashing, screaming. The flank was collapsing. Dobbs turned to McCready. "What do we do?" McCready didn't hesitate. "We hold," he said, eyes blazing. "We give 'em the storm again." They ran. Not away, but toward the collapsing flank. The trench was chaos. Fire, smoke, screams, gunfire. Dobbs jumped over a dying soldier and fired into a group of 3 enemies trying to breach the inner trench wall. The shells tore through all of them. Blood sprayed the wall behind them like someone had thrown a bucket of paint. They kept going. McCready kicked over an ammo crate, reloaded as he ran, and dropped 2 more Japanese soldiers who had tried to flank their position. Jenkins was behind them now, bloody and grinning like a man who had nothing left to lose. They slammed and fired and slammed again. By the time it was over, the jungle was quiet again. But it wasn't the peace of victory. It was exhaustion, the kind that soaked into your bones and made your hands forget how to let go of a weapon. Dobbs stood in the smoke, chest heaving, surrounded by shell casings and corpses. McCready clapped him on the back. "You're not a rookie anymore," he said. Dobbs didn't respond. He just looked at the trench, the tunnel, the wreckage, and waited, because he knew They'd be back. That night, the rain finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. The jungle didn't hum. It didn't chirp or rustle. It just breathed, slow, heavy, like it was waiting to see who'd die next. Smoke still curled up from the trench line like dying ghosts. The smell of blood, gunpowder, and rot hung so thick in the air, you could taste it on your tongue. Dobbs sat with his back against the trench wall, shotgun resting across his lap. His hands were blistered from the heat of firing too many rounds. His uniform was crusted with dried blood. Some his, some Jenkins', some from men who no longer had faces. He couldn't sleep. He didn't want to, because if he closed his eyes, he knew what he'd see. That boy with the bayonet, eyes wide like he didn't even understand he was dying. The gunner's chest exploding, the katana slicing through air, through flesh. McCready finally slumped down beside him with a grunt, cradling his M12 like it was a piece of his soul. "You still breathing, hero?" he asked without looking. Dobbs nodded slowly. "Barely." Mac lit a cigarette with shaking hands, took a long drag, and passed it over. Dobbs accepted it. The first puff burned his lungs, but he didn't cough. He didn't care anymore. "We lost 15, Mac said quietly. "Nearly half the company, and battalion's radio is dead. No backup, no air support, no medevac." Dobbs stared at him. "So we're just sitting here, waiting for them to finish us off?" Mac blew out smoke and stared at the dark trees. "They'll come at dawn," he said. "They always do. Think it gives them some kind of honor. Bastards like making a show of it." "Then what's the plan?" Dobbs asked. Mac turned his head slowly. "We make it a bloodbath they'll never forget." As the first gray light of morning crept through the trees, the trench turned into a war machine. Those still breathing worked in silence, reinforcing walls, stacking bodies to block holes, loading every remaining shell into shotguns, boxes, even empty helmets. The last dozen men left of Charlie Company were outnumbered 10-1. But they weren't afraid anymore. Something else had replaced fear, hate, grit, rage. McCready gave Dobbs a sawed-off M12 from a fallen comrade. "You'll need both hands," he said. "They won't stop this time. No more probing. They're gonna hit us like a goddamn hammer." Dobbs looked down at the twin shotguns resting across his legs. "I'm ready," he said. The moment came, with a single war cry that split, the air like lightning. Then, hell, dozens of Japanese. Troops broke through the jungle, running at full speed, screaming, eyes full of fire. Behind them came mortars, sending up sprays of dirt and fire as the trench shook violently. But this time, the Americans didn't duck. They rose. McCready stood tall on the lip of the trench, both barrels blazing as he slam-fired with practiced fury. Jenkins let loose a wild scream and ran forward with 2 grenades in hand, pulling both pins and diving into a group of advancing soldiers. The blast lit up the trees. Dobbs stepped onto the trench wall with both M12s in his hands. He didn't fire at first. He waited. Let them come. When they were close enough that he could see the whites of their eyes, he pulled both triggers. The twin boom shook the trench. 2 enemies dropped, twisted into the mud. He pumped and fired again. The slam fire echoed like thunder. Left barrel, right barrel, again and again. His shoulders screamed from the force, but he didn't stop. He became a machine. Every man in the trench poured out what little they had left. Shotguns, pistols, even knives when the ammo ran dry. The trench was swallowed in smoke and screams. Japanese soldiers fell in waves, cut down before they could even swing their blades. And then something changed. They broke. The enemy turned. Not many, but some. A ripple of hesitation ran through the survivors, and suddenly the charge became a retreat. Bloodied and stunned, the Japanese survivors vanished back into the trees. It was over. Dobbs dropped to his knees, gasping, surrounded by broken wood, burning leaves, and mangled bodies. He could hear only the beat of his heart and the drip of blood from his chin to the mud. McCready walked over, limping, one hand pressed to a wound on his side. "They ran," he said, almost laughing. "They ran, damn it!" Dobbs looked up at him, tears mixing with dirt on his face. "They weren't ready," he said hoarsely. "For the storm?" Mac nodded. "No, but now they know it." They had won the fight, but it didn't feel like victory. The sun was up now, struggling through the smoky mist above the jungle. The light revealed everything in brutal honesty. The trench soaked in blood, the shredded remains of helmets and limbs, the broken bodies lying like rag dolls along the tree line. Charlie Company, once 70 strong, was down to 9. McCready stood near the edge of the trench, shirt half torn, one side of his body wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage. His face looked older now, carved with lines that hadn't been there yesterday. He stared into the jungle like he expected it to speak. Dobbs sat on an overturned ammo crate, reloading his 2 shotguns with shaking hands. Every time he pushed in a shell, he remembered a face. Jenkins, the quiet kid who shared his rations. Lewis, the Joker. Letard Harrington, who had promised they'd be home by Christmas. All gone. The last few men moved like ghosts. Silent, focused. No one spoke. They were past needing words. They had become creatures of instinct, trained by hell and hardened by the kind of survival no human should ever endure. Suddenly, a rustling came from the north end of the trench. The men froze. Dobbs was on his feet in an instant, both shotguns raised. McCready lifted his weapon slowly. The other survivors did the same, forming a loose line along the trench, eyes locked on the tree line. "Could be wounded stragglers," one whispered. "Or scouts coming to finish us off," another replied. The leaves shifted again. Then a figure emerged. Tall, broad, wearing an American helmet. "Jesus," McCready muttered. "Friendly?" 2 more appeared behind him, each carrying gear marked with a red cross. A 4th man stepped forward, holding a field radio the size of a small crate. "We're 2nd Battalion," he shouted over the distance. "Heard gunfire all night. Command sent us to check." What the hell happened here? Dobbs didn't lower his weapon. He couldn't. Not yet. McCready finally stepped forward. "Charlie Company held the line," he said, voice hoarse. "We stopped them. But we're damn near finished." The newcomers looked around, expressions turning grim as they stepped into the trench and saw the scale of the carnage. One of the medics dropped to his knees beside a dying soldier, working frantically to stop the bleeding. Another soldier just stared at the torn-up jungle, whispering something under his breath. "You boys used shotguns?" one of them asked, eyeing the piles of spent shells. "Winchester M12s, Dobbs said quietly. "We slam-fired every round we had." The soldier whistled, low and long. "No wonder it looks like hell dropped in for breakfast." Over the next hour, the medics worked, and the rest of the battalion spread out to secure the area. Dobbs sat against the trench wall again, letting the numbness crawl up his spine. They brought water, cigarettes, supplies, but none of it changed what had happened. He watched one of the new men pick up a fallen shotgun. The barrel was scorched. The wood was cracked. It had clearly fired too many times in too little time. "You ever seen this kind of carnage before?" the soldier asked McCready. Mac gave a hollow laugh. "Only once, back in New Guinea. But even then, we had numbers. This time, it was just the storm." The soldier nodded slowly. "We heard stories about you boys. They're already calling this the slam-fire line. Said a handful of Americans stopped a whole goddamn battalion." Dobbs looked up at that, eyes bloodshot. "Let them tell their stories," he said. "But make sure they know the price." And then, for the first time since the fighting started, he let the shotgun drop from his lap. It hit the dirt with a soft thud, still warm, because the war wasn't over. But for now, just for a moment, he could breathe. They called it the Slamfire Line, a stretch of soaked jungle trench barely 40 yards long, where a few men held off a human tide, armed with steel and death. The brass loved that name. They used it in dispatches, radio reports, and propaganda leaflets like it was some kind of miracle. But for the men who survived it, it wasn't a legend. It was a wound that wouldn't close. 3 days later, Dobbs sat alone at the edge of the jungle while the rest of 2nd Battalion began the slow process of clearing out the dead, burning the rot, and burying what was left of Charlie Company. His boots were still caked with the same mud and blood from that night. He hadn't changed. He couldn't. The shotgun rested beside him, both barrels wiped clean, shells lined up carefully in rows on a battered ammo tin. Every now and then, he would reload and slam fire into the empty jungle, not for practice, but to chase away the silence. Because when it was quiet, the screaming came back. McCready approached from behind, limping on a wrapped leg, a cigar clamped between his teeth. "You know, some colonel from command showed up today," he said, easing himself onto a fallen log. "Said he wants to shake hands with the men who turned a trench into a fortress. Offered me a medal I didn't ask for." Dobbs didn't answer. He just looked out into the mist where the trees turned black. "They want to promote you," Mac continued. "Make you a corporal, maybe even a sergeant. Said you've got guts." "I don't want rank," Dobbs said quietly. "I want Jenkins back. I want my nightmares to stop." Mac exhaled slowly. "Yeah, me too." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Mac flicked the cigar into the mud and leaned forward. "You know what nobody talks about?" he said. "What it feels like when you hold a shotgun and turn another man inside out. They cheer you for it. They call you brave. But you know what I see when I close my eyes?" He paused, then said, "His teeth, flying through the air like confetti." Dobbs turned to look at him. Mac wasn't smiling. His hands trembled just slightly. It wasn't the wound. It was something deeper. "We didn't fight to be heroes," Mac went on. "We fought because we were cornered. And when you corner an American with a shotgun, he doesn't pray. He doesn't beg. He burns his way out." That was the real truth of the Slamfire Line. It wasn't about glory. It was about survival. It was about what a man becomes when he's pushed too far into the dirt, with nothing left but rage and steel. Suddenly, a young runner came sprinting through the trees. "Sir!" Radio contact just came in from Battalion HQ. "Japanese forces are regrouping 2 miles west. Looks like another offensive is brewing. They're calling for defensive positions to be reinforced immediately." Mac looked at Dobbs. "Looks like we're not done yet." Dobbs stood slowly, picking up his shotgun. He checked the shells in the tube, thumbed in 2 more, and snapped it closed with a grim finality. "Let them come," he said. "We still have some storm left." They walked back together toward what was left of the trench. Men were digging again, laying barbed wire, planting tripwires, reinforcing firing positions. But this time, when Dobbs walked past, they didn't just nod, they made space. Not out of fear, but respect. The Slamfire Line had taken most of them, but what remained had been forged into something harder than iron. By nightfall, Dobbs was back on the line, shotgun across his knees, eyes fixed on the black tree line. Rain started falling again, soft at first, then heavier. Thunder rumbled far off. He didn't flinch, because if death was coming again, so was he. The rain that night came down like judgment. Sheets of it fell over the trench, turning mud into sludge, and every movement into a slow, dragging effort. Most of the men cursed it. Dobbs didn't. He welcomed it. Rain meant silence. Rain meant less visibility. And in this war, sometimes the best chance at living was not being seen. Still, the jungle had that feeling again. That stillness, like something was crawling beneath the earth, waiting for the signal to rise. Dobbs felt it in his bones. The way the leaves didn't move. The way the air felt heavy, like holding your breath before a scream. McCready crouched beside him, flipping open a tin of soggy cigarettes. "You feel it too?" he asked, voice low. Dobbs nodded. Yeah, they weren't the only ones. Every man along the slam fire line, now reinforced and rebuilt, seemed on edge. New recruits had been shuffled in, but none of them looked ready. Some were still baby-faced, eyes wide behind clean helmets. They hadn't seen the trench when it was soaked in blood, hadn't smelled the smoke of burning flesh or wiped brain matter off their rifles. The veterans stood apart, quiet, watchful, like wolves among sheep. Dobbs leaned against the trench wall and wiped the rain from his face, fingers brushing the scar just under his left eye. New, from a piece of shrapnel that barely missed blinding him 3 nights ago. The pain had dulled, but the memory of it, it never went away. Suddenly, movement in the trees. Not loud, not fast, just enough to snap the thread of calm. Dobbs stiffened. He raised the shotgun slowly, finger hovering over the trigger. McCready was already up, crouching, peering into the darkness. Then came the whispering. Dozens of soft voices moving through the jungle like wind, but too deliberate, too human. Mac gritted his teeth. They're flanking, using the rain as cover, probably surrounding the trench. Classic pincer move, Dobbs muttered. Smart bastards. A red flare lit up the sky behind the jungle. And then came the howl. Not a battle cry. Not like before. This one was guttural, inhuman. Like they weren't charging with courage, but desperation. Like they had nothing left to lose. The jungle exploded. From all sides, Japanese soldiers poured forward, faces painted, eyes wild, crawling out of tunnels, sliding from trees, rising from the mud like the dead themselves. Some were missing limbs. Some were wrapped in bloodied rags. All of them were screaming. The trench lit up with gunfire. Dobbs didn't hesitate. He brought the Winchester up and pulled the trigger. Boom! Slam fired once. Boom! Again. Boom! Boom! Every shot cut through the rain like thunder, tearing through the wave of bodies charging toward him. He kept the trigger down, pumping like a madman. Every round a promise of death. Shells flew, smoke choked the air, and still the enemy kept coming. A soldier dropped into the trench beside him with a scream, bayonet stabbing wildly. Dobbs ducked, spun, and smashed the shotgun stock into the man's jaw. Bones cracked, blood sprayed, and the body dropped. He didn't stop. He fired at point-blank range into the next attacker, the muzzle nearly touching flesh. The blast blew the man backward into 3 others, painting the trench wall red. To his left, a young recruit froze in panic, rifle jammed, mouth open in terror. Dobbs stepped in front of him. 2 slugs. 2 bodies dropped before they ever reached the trench. "Reload, kid," he barked. "Or die!" The recruit snapped out of it, fumbled for a clip. McCready was a few yards down, holding the right flank alone. His trench coat was drenched in blood, rain, and ash. He'd discarded his helmet. His face was twisted in fury as he fired shell after shell into the mob, eyes wild, mouth shouting curses in between blasts. Dobbs climbed the trench ladder halfway and fired into the open jungle, raining hot steel down into the enemy's second wave. Some of the Japanese soldiers broke, turning, retreating, but most didn't. They kept climbing, dying, falling. It was madness. A grenade landed at Dobbs's feet. He kicked it into the trench wall just as it exploded. The blast knocked him sideways, throwing him hard into the mud. His ears rang, but his hands still gripped the shotgun. He rolled over, coughing, spitting blood, then racked the slide and stood back up. The storm hadn't passed. He was the storm, and if this was their last stand, then he'd go down with both barrels blazing. The ground was shaking, not from thunder, not from rain, but from bodies. Too many boots, too many lives screaming across the jungle floor all at once. The slam fire line had become a vortex of fire and death. The trench was no longer a position. It was a killing field. Dobbs couldn't feel his legs anymore. He'd been standing so long his muscles felt like stone. His hands were numb, but he kept pumping shells through the Winchester like a machine. Shell. Slam. Fire. Repeat. The metal of the shotgun was searing hot. The wood scorched black in places, but he wouldn't let it go. All around him, the trench was caving in under the weight of the assault. McCready was limping now, face bleeding, one eye swollen shut, still firing with single-handed defiance. The young recruit he'd protected earlier, Miller, was now reloading for him, kneeling like a priest feeding ammunition to a god of war. "We're getting overrun!" someone screamed from the far side. "They're in the rear trench!" Dobbs's heart dropped. If they'd flanked the rear, it meant the slam fire line was surrounded, and there was no retreat, no backup, no clean end. McCready grabbed Dobbs by the arm, blood dripping from his sleeve. "We fall back now, we die in a field like dogs. We hold this trench," Dobbs nodded, "not out of courage, but because there was no other choice." Then it happened. A burst of machine gun fire lit up the ridge above the trench. But it wasn't Japanese. It was American. High above the line, silhouettes appeared, dozens of them, pouring lead down into the jungle. Brown fatigues, heavy helmets. One held a mounted bar. Another dropped a satchel of grenades right into the heart of the enemy's rear assault. The jungle exploded. It was reinforcements. Dobbs could barely believe it. He laughed. A raw, broken sound, as he fired 2 more shells into the chaos, then dropped behind cover, sliding into the trench floor. McCready fell beside him, chest heaving. "How the hell did they find us?" Dobbs asked between gasps. McCready coughed blood and grinned. "Guess someone finally read a damn map." More Americans flooded the line, firing, shouting, dragging the wounded out. Medics jumped into the trenches like angels in mud-stained uniforms. The air changed. The smell of fear shifted into the smell of burning enemy uniforms. The screaming became theirs, and just like that, the slam fire line held. Hours passed. The jungle quieted again, but this time for good. Dobbs sat at the edge of the trench, staring at the barrel of his shotgun like it was a sacred relic. His hands were blistered. His uniform was torn. He had a shrapnel wound in his thigh that he didn't even feel until the adrenaline wore off. McCready lay beside him, smoking a bent cigarette with one eye open. He looked like death, but he was still breathing. "You know what they're calling it now?" a young soldier from the new unit said as he passed by. "The bloodline. They said what you guys did here wasn't human." Dobbs looked up. "It wasn't," he said softly. Mac chuckled. "Nah, it was American." By the next day, brass had rolled in with cameras, reporters, and shiny new officers who hadn't fired a shot. They praised the spirit of resistance, handed out medals, and shook hands like it meant something. Dobbs stood through it, quiet, detached. He didn't care about speeches. He only cared about the 9 dog tags he now wore around his neck. 1 for each man who bled beside him. 1 for Jenkins. 1 for every brother who'd picked up a shotgun and held the line when the world tried to erase them. As the sun began to set, Dobbs climbed out of the trench for the last time. McCready limped beside him, resting his weight on a stick carved from jungle wood. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to. They just walked into the trees. 2 men whose souls had been forged by fire and steel, heading toward the next storm. Because deep down, they knew war wasn't over, but neither were they.